All right. I think it's 4:35. Time to start. We don't have a ton of formal stuff. We'll go through, what we've done in 15 minutes and hopefully leave enough, about 10 minutes for Q&A. My name is Omri Gazit. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Acerto.
Jerry Gable, VP of Product and Standards at Strata Identity.
Alan Foster, ex-ForgeRock, and now, as everybody keeps pointing out, allegedly retired.
David Broussard, intern.
Is it A Back to the Future? He's
A Back
responsible
to the
for those
Future.
stickers, yeah.
If you want stickers, I got a bunch of A Back to the Future stickers because we all know A Back in policy is the way to go in authorization. Because I'm told that there's graph, but the guy who talks about graph is not in the room.
No.
So.
You're supposed to say that later.
I'll say it for later.
Too early.
So before we start, just show hands, who knows what AuthZEN is?
All right,
cool.
Excellent. It's more than half of the room. Fantastic. So, Jerry, Alan, maybe you can take us through the history of how we got here, kind of the evolution of the specs and the cacophony of vendors and implementations that we have today, none of which talk to each other.
Oh, sure. Throw it at me.
Yeah. That was the idea.
So it sort of brings up the little bit of a history of how we got to AuthZEN, right? And we've had a lot of work over the last how many years around authentication standardization. And unfortunately, you cannot really get to proper authorization without having some agreement around authentication and some agreement as who the user is. About 2 years ago, we started talking, and last year, anybody who was here last year remembers there was a lot of authorization discussion on the stage. Right? We had the final panel. I think you and I were on it.
Yeah,
the final
two of
panel
you.
we were going. There were several different things where authorization kept coming up and up. And so at that point, we got together a bunch of vendors at Identiverse last year to say, hey, are there some standardization things we can do here to try and have us work together? And that was the start of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting that while it took us, say 20 years or so to make that happen, as you see here, authorization really became its own thing around 2001 with the exactable standardization at that time. And we've had, some developments over the years, Alpha, NIST, putting out guidance, their NGAC model, for example, the CEDAR language now more recently. So there's been lots of developments over, say 20 years or so. And lots of vendors, some have come and gone. But more recently, there's, 15 or so commercial products in the authorization space, a whole slew of open source projects. So there's a lot of activity, a lot of investment, a lot of innovation going on to try and figure out how to solve the authorization challenge for customers. And finally, over the last year, we got together and tried to work on standardization.
Yep. So, basically the couple of things that we thought were worth standardizing. We have a few of them kind of to describe, starting with the first. But David, how about you take us through the different pieces, the different components, and what we decided to go
So
start
when
on.
we really got back to AuthZEN last year, we decided we'd focus on three main things, right? Three main things that we think are achievable within AuthZEN. Number one, the PEP PDP protocol. If you look at all the standards we had on the previous slide, it was very much different standards, but they all sort of spoke the same way, but not quite the same way. So OPA and ZACBOL and Alpha and CEDAR have different ways of talking. So the number one rule was get the PEP PDP protocol fixed. And it's very simple because at the end of the day, authorization is, can I do this? Yes, you can. No, you can't. So we could get consensus pretty easily around that. The second thing was design patterns. What does it mean to do authorization? If you talk to OAuth folks, they're gonna tell you it's all about tokens. If you talk to externalized authorization folks, they're gonna say it's all about the yes/no question. So what are the design patterns? And Alex over there is actually working with Eve Mailer on defining those patterns within the AuthZEN group. And then the third thing is really the policy management side of things. How do you? And I say policy, it's a biased word. I should say the configuration management. Really, how do you handle the configuration? How do you distribute the configuration to your different authorization services or PDPs? And then there's another dimension here on this slide, which is what I call the PIP, or what we call the PIP, which is more about where the data resides. And there's really two camps. They have pros and cons, both. One is you control the whole data and you reason on the data, and the other one is you go fetch the data as you need to fetch the data, right? And it kind of influences what your implementation is going to look like in its pros and its cons.
Yeah, so basically, I would say the more recent history is by October of 2023, last year, we got close to being able to agree on what it is that we wanted to do and how we wanted to sequence things. So we went to the OpenID Foundation, which seemed like a great arbiter of this kind of work, being the home of OpenID Connect. And the way that we thought about what we wanted to do is really we wanted to create the OpenID Connect moment, the OIDC moment for the authorization world. And so the first thing, the low-hanging fruit, as David said, was to work on the PEP PDP spec. But importantly, we also feel like there's other things that we want to follow up on. So how to discover and manage policies, and also how to get data from the policy information points into the PDP. All of those things are very different across implementations and don't necessarily need to be. So we focused initially on something very simple. And the idea was, the very intentional idea here was to try to get a win under our belts as quickly as possible. And you oftentimes see these kinds of standardization efforts taking a long time because you have a wide scope that you're trying to boil from day one. And our approach here was to try to get something done quickly, build a lot of shared context between us. And once we had that win, we could kind of graduate to some of the harder topics, which no doubt, are in front of us. So we now have declared the first implementer's draft of the most basic part of authorization, which is send a request that has a subject, an action, and a resource and a context, and get back a response, which is a decision. And that's exactly the interop scenario that we defined. We defined a simple to-do app that basically takes a single request, gets back a single response. And maybe, David, do you want to go through the next slide? Because you created it so beautifully.
I know. I'm an artist. I should just, go to art school. So the whole idea is we're going to have...
You need to. Ouch. Wow. Best served cold.
So we defined a very simple use case. It's a to-do app. It's a use case that's being used by a lot of implementations. I think we stole it from Cedar or maybe from you.
I cheated. I took some sample that we already had with a canned IDP and I reappropriated it for AuthZEN.
And it's really simple. You have a user, and that user, or you have a set of users, and they could play different roles. They could have different relationships to the data. The data is a list of to-do items that you have to do. I mean, they're to-do items. And there's a different set of actions that you could do, create, edit, delete, complete, so on and so forth. And then based on the role that you play and based on the underlying configuration or the underlying policy or the underlying graph, you're going to be granted or denied access to that particular resource. We have a website that Henri put together that summarizes the to-do app and the use cases. You can actually connect to that website if you want to go browse, and you can actually try the demo app yourselves. It's online. Just to see the impact of using different policies. And if we look at the following slide, you'll see the interop architecture. So here's the to-do UI. It's a UI built in React, if I remember correctly.
Yep. And
it connects to the backend to-do app with a very simple MySQLite database, I think, or SQLite database. I'm sorry.
SQLite.
Yep. Don't mix vendors, David. And then we connected to the AuthZEN interface of the different implementations that we have. So the Acerto implementation, Topaz, different Axiomatics, Talus. We have the list of vendors on the following slide. And because we all use that same request response protocol, that JSON payload you saw a couple slides ago, it just works. And that's the single biggest win. And it to be honest, pre-AuthZEN, it was embarrassing that Open Policy Agent did something that was 95% the same thing as what Zachwell does, or that was 95% the same thing as what some other vendor did or some other framework did. It was embarrassing that we had that 5% difference, and now we're all the same. Woohoo!
Yep. So yeah, one important thing to note is like if you go to the demo site, we have a little drop down that lets you pick one of 12 PDPs. And so you can, the cool thing about it is that you can select one PDP to create to-dos, from various users, select a different PDP to, complete them or delete them, and select yet another one to view them. And they all work the same. So it's a terribly boring demo. That's why we decided not to actually go do it live, but it's a very simple demo.
Actually, should we?
We could if, yeah. Yeah, we'll set it up after we go through the slides. If you guys want to see the demo, we can do that. But, I'm sorry? Yep. So, Jerry, take us through the Interop participants.
Sure. So, here you see the names of the folks who were involved in actually doing the implementation. Some people did extra credit and did more than one. That was pretty awesome. But I think what also is represented here is quite a wide array of different approaches on the back end, on the PDP or the decisioning side of things. So to your point, David, it was fairly simple, I think, for most of the implementers to integrate with this approach. So that was really gratifying to see.
Yeah, and maybe a third of those implementations did it in the last few days before the interop, so it shows how easy it was to get going, right? And then also one more thing I want to point out, because some of those implementations are open policy agent based, it was easy for Omri to sort of stretch a little from the work you'd done on Topaz and Acerto and do it for open policy agent neutrally. And likewise for us, Axiomatics being based on ZACWL and Alpha, extending out to Talus, which is also ZACWL and Alpha based. That was super easy. So multiple wins.
Right, and also we have an example of two different styles of OPA integration, right? Because we use our Hexa plugin for OPA, and we're able to consume IDQL policies. So lots of different formats were represented here, and it's nice to see that we can all do the simple function, and on the back end all get the same kind of response back.
Yeah, and I don't know if Eve is in the room, but if she was in the room, she would probably speak to this slide because it's a Venn diagram. I just want to point out that all the cool kids are on the left in the crowded space, and then there's that one little singleton on the right-hand side. I don't know who that person is, really.
I'll actually speak more seriously to it. I think the place where we haven't invested enough is getting reback implementations to implement the same thing. We have OpenFGA that's certainly taken a look, and they weren't able to complete it by this time, but the spec itself is simple enough to be able to go pull this off, and that's something that I think we, like the explicit desire for the working group is not just to be another place to create more ABAC standards. It's really to stretch, the tent wide and make sure that we can create a set of specifications that work across all the different models and implementations. And in fact, that actually requires us, ironically, to be more opinionated as opposed to less opinionated. That's one of the things that we've concluded as part of doing the interop. Those are some of the learnings.
So just to exemplify what you said, if you take ZACWL as an example, so it defines a request response protocol, and that's pretty much it. So if you wanted to send an empty request, that's actually legit from a ZACWL standpoint. If you wanted to use username or user ID or UID, that's all very legit. If you want to use action or ACID or whatever, everything is allowed, which is great. It's extremely flexible, but it's also bad because then when you start implementing, you don't really know what attributes to use. Being opinionated is saying we want to have a UID or an ID or defining a certain set of attributes that we want to have in the request. We did not do that for the interop, but like in the next step, we're going to do that. And that's going to help be more accepting of or more compatible with, say, graph-based implementations.
So last couple of slides, let's go real quick so that we can deliver on our promise to leave 10 minutes for Q&A. What's next? We have a single request response. One of the things that we want to do is what we call a boxcard APIs that allows you to boxcar multiple requests in a single HTTP payload and get back multiple responses. And then we have search scenarios. So the idea that for a particular user, what resources do they have a permission on, and vice versa. For a particular resource, what objects of type user have a particular permission on that. All of those are interesting scenarios, and we feel like they're all within scope. Besides this, we think that the to-do is just, kind of like scratching the surface. There are a number of different scenarios that are fairly commonly implemented. The Google Drive scenario is a classic scenario that a lot of different implementations provide examples for. So that's low-hanging fruit for us to add additional interop scenarios. We also feel like this is kind of a bunch of vendors that, are getting together, and that's all fine and good. But until we actually have relying parties, i.e., companies that are implementers of SaaS applications or, homegrown enterprise applications, we're not quite there. And so we're definitely welcoming additional folks to come in and give us feedback from the, customer and from the, SaaS side. And lastly, as we promised before, it's not just about PEP to PDP. It's also about policy discovery and distribution and management, as well as how to get data into the engine, which is honestly the hardest thing about authorization. And lastly, here's where to find us.
Yeah, so there's the OpenID Foundation's website for the working group, and you all are welcome to join us. There's, 30 or 40 folks, something like that. We have weekly calls now suitable for folks from Asia-Pac to join us at a reasonable hour, not 4 a.m. David, where are you? There you are. Starting next week, I think, or the week after. So, we're welcoming anyone else who wants to join us. Hopefully, we're here next year with more elaborate interop scenarios to show you, because there is so much more work to do. But I just feel like there's a lot of momentum right now. There's a lot of emphasis on this part of the market, and I think if we can help to standardize certain aspects of the interactions, that can be really beneficial for the whole industry.
I just want to add in one piece on that about getting involved with talking about the standards, because a lot of the meetings that we have had have gotten contentious, where we argue about various things. And one of the things about it is this a feature that people want? Right? Is it something that's going to be used, and how much time do we end up spending on it? And I'm thinking of things like advice and obligations, which is a discussion that we've had at least once, but several times. And there's other ones in there, right? Does it make sense? Do we need to put more work into things like the boxcaring and having lots of requests in a single request? Or is a single request easier and where we want to focus? And so the input of the folks who are going to be ultimately using that standard are much appreciated. And we're trying to put that into sort of the guidelines and trying to work out the usage patterns of how are people going to use it. So come and get involved, absolutely, please.
All right, with that, let's see if we have any questions in the back.
Yeah, just asking more from a business side, business perspective. You guys are all trying to do the same thing. You're collaborating, but you're also competitors. I'm sort of likening this to how the mobile platforms panned out. At the end of the day, we're left with two. We all remember Palm and BlackBerry and everybody. And so I was just curious about your take on that in this industry. How much space is there left on top of the hill, and how many companies can really ultimately fit there? Will this be like one company gobbling up another, and that's how you standardize ultimately? So just would love your opinion on that.
Yeah, that's. Let me repeat the question. The question is business dynamics. There are a number of vendors, and what do we see the end game? We're all collaborating apparently, but we're all competitors. I think one thing that you'll notice is we're all kind of friends here. We're all competitors. We know that, and we compete fiercely. But at the same time, we all know that this thing hasn't happened yet, and it hasn't happened because it's been, there hasn't been the OIDC moment, right? There are a bunch of vendors. Each one has its own set of interfaces, its own approach to things, and has largely gone it alone. And in order to actually get to a market, we actually need to be able to speak with a single voice on certain things and be very clear about where we're different and how we compete.
And I just to add to what you said, Amaury, it's also not just an IAM issue. So you compared it to mobile. I would compare it to OIDC. It's maybe a comparison closer to home. But the challenge with authorization is not just an IAM issue. It's a medical issue. So we got to go talk to medical software vendors like Epic. It's a finance issue. We got to go talk to the finance app builders and so on and so forth, which is why it's been, I think, hard for authorization to grow the past 10 years. So now we need to find that thing that's going to make us be as successful as OAuth and OIDC. And it's not just, I think it's not just us competing. The pie is big enough. When we manage to build that pie, it'll be big enough.
Just one small follow-up question since Strahd is here. Can you speak to IDQL and where this fits into that?
Speak to IDQL.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. As I mentioned before, we were one of the interop scenarios, right, where we defined the policy in IDQL, and with our Hexa plugin for OPA, it's able to directly interpret that as a policy instead of using Rego. Going forward, I think on the previous slide, where we talk more about the interactions between an administration point and how the policies get to a PDP, will be more front and center for where IDQL fits into this whole picture.
I think we had a question back there.
You said like you are interacting with OPA is also part of this. Like how is OPA going to change the way they are doing things? Because we came up with the PEP to PDP API.
Yep.
So is OPA going to change the way they are making these queries, or how does this fit into the regulation?
So I'll say, first of all, almost all the implementations so far are proxies. And so we have a layer, that translates the AuthZEN API to essentially the native format. I think we have Chris here from the Styra team. Anders from the Styra team has also been, tracking. And over time, we feel like every one of these implementations, if we're successful, they'll add native endpoints in addition to the endpoints they already have. Of course, no one's going to go, throw out what they already have. They don't want to break customers, but the requirements for adding endpoints that are AuthZEN compatible are fairly modest and very easy to implement. So one of the things that we try to do is to get to an implementer's draft so that we have enough stability in the spec so that implementers like, the Open Policy Agent, which is an open source project, Andrew said, open an issue in GitHub, we'll prioritize it, we'll put it in. And, that's kind of how things work, right? And so over time, our expectation is that in order to be certified as an AuthZEN compatible product, you actually need to support it natively.
I just want to add in one more point on the previous question about the group of standardization. And I think a lot of it comes down to the problem of external authorization, right? We're buying into the idea of if you're building an app, you can call out to something to give you an answer. The only way that you can reliably do that as a developer is if you know that that's going to be there no matter what happens sort of on the other side. So by having that standard, it's avoiding the vendor lock-in that companies come and go, products come and go, you get new features, etc. But your app still works because it's using a standardized model.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Yep.
Yeah, so customers want to manage multiple SaaS apps with kind of a common control plane across those. But each of those has a very rich resource model for you to build those policies against. Do you have any thoughts on how to harmonize that so we can?
David?
It's a really good question, and I think it depends on how old that SaaS app is and how ingrained, no pun intended, their authorization model is. Yeah, you could mention Salesforce. I was at Salesforce for a few years on the identity side, not the authorization side. But Salesforce is a great example of an app because it's a CRM, so the data is very well defined. You have contacts, accounts, opportunities. To write a policy in Axiomatics or in any of the vendors on Salesforce data is child's play. It makes total sense. It's super easy. To then enforce the policy on Salesforce is not easy. It's nearly impossible. And the reason for that is they don't give you the hooks to call out to that external decision engine, right? So our call out to, when Omri says we want relying parties, what we really want is Salesforce. And it's going to be hard for them, right? Because they got 20 years worth or 24 years worth of building the product. But for any new product, instead of building the authorization model inside of that product, providing hooks, much like today at Salesforce, you can do SAML, you can do OpenID Connect, you can do SCIM too. You can do some level of provisioning into Salesforce, right? Do that same thing for authorization, but it's going to be a hard battle, and I think what's in it for Salesforce or any other vendor is, well, you're going to save time instead of developing your own authorization model and then having to cut corners or having to, do this or do weird stuff. You can actually call out to an external engine and tell your customers, hey, you can do policies in that thing. You can reuse those policies in Workday and SAP. You get better transparency, better visibility, better auditability. And Salesforce, I'm not wasting developer cycles on stuff that I'm not a pro at.
Yeah, we're going to explore that more, like we saw on the future to-do list, on that interaction, how do I get a policy to Salesforce? And so it's not just about the runtime call out to a PDP, but is there an API for policy administration? And so that's the key. That'll be the key aspect of that work. As far as formats and so on, that's an add-on. But it's really getting down to, is there a way to call out, or is there an API where I can manage policies in those target platforms?
And I get to say the last word. Ultimately, this is about a pattern, like everybody said here. And when we make it falling off a log easy for developers to fall into that pit of success, to follow the pattern, externalize their authorization, that's when we start winning, right? So it's perhaps Salesforce is, maybe a decade away, but the important companies that are born today, if they actually from the get-go start externalizing authorization, think of this just like OIDC, just like Passport.js, when it was easier for developers to actually go the correct architectural way to externalize authentication, that's when we hit the tipping point. And that's where we're trying to get to with authorization. We ain't there yet. We're just at the beginning of the road, but we're actually very optimistic about getting there. I think that's all of the time we have. Thank you.
Thank you.